Okay, this is the page from which you can download the Weaving Project Calculator, which is an Excel spreadsheet, but you can open it in any application that'll work with spreadsheets. So to download it, you just click on the button or click on the Weaving Project Calculator name that highlights there in yellow. And it will download. Probably your browser will show it downloading here in the bottom left corner, and then you just click on that to open it up. Now, I don't have Excel installed on my computer, so it's just opening in the software that I usually use for spreadsheets. You'll notice here in the spreadsheet that there are several yellow fields. Those are the ones that you can edit, and when you hit the Tab key, you cycle through them. And if you hold down the Shift key and hit Tab, then you go up instead of down. So Tab will take you to the next field that you can edit. In some applications, you can select other places, but you can't edit them. So each row has to the left of the field an explanation of the information that goes into the field. So this first one, that's where you put the desired finished length per item. This yellow one is the one you edit. It is the take up and shrinkage, which is a percentage. This white one is the total woven length for the item, but it will be calculated automatically because it's in white, not in yellow. The two spots here with percentages, in both of these cases, there's a default assumed percentage that is the average of the values in the suggested range. So here it defaults to 15%, which is the average of 10 and 20. Here it defaults to 12.5%, which is the average of 10 to 15. But you can override those values by putting another number in here. If you actually enter 0 here, it will assume that there's nothing in the field, and so it will go back to the default. But if you want to put something that is nearly 0, that will calculate as 0, you can just put in something that's very close to 0 and it will round, but still override the default percentages. All right, so let's work through an example. Let's say we're going to make some placemats, and my desired finished length per placemat is 18 inches. Now, this defaults to 15%, which is 2.7 inches. But I'm going to say, no, I don't think it's going to be that many. I think it's going to be more like 10. So I can override that by putting 10 in this field here. And then that calculates 10% of 18 is 1.8. And then these two numbers added together are 19.8 inches. That is how long I should weave each placemat to get an end result of 18 if I'm expecting 10% dimensional loss warp-wise. Then I have to tell it how many placemats I'm going to weave, and let's say 6. So now it calculates the length of each placemat times the number of placemats. That gives you the total woven length. That's the part of the warp that the weft goes in for all of your items, or in this case, 18.8 inches. We're going to see that number again in a little while, the total woven length. Next, we're going to calculate the total unwoven warp length. So this number here, and to get that, we do this section. So first, the desired length of fringe, because fringe doesn't get woven. If you don't have any fringe, you can leave that as 0. I'm going to say, I usually make my placemat fringes about 3/4 of an inch, but I'm going to add just a little bit extra so I can trim them off even at 3/4 of an inch, so I'll say 1. And then, of course, you have to have fringe at both ends of your placemat, so it's automatically multiplied by 2. So I have 2 inches now for the end of one placemat and the beginning of the next. You multiply that amount by the number of betweens that you have. You don't need to multiply it by all of the items to be woven, because your beginning fringe and your end fringe can come out of loom waste. What you need is the fringe that comes between the different items, which is 1 less than the total number of items. So if you're only making a single thing, this all works out to 0 anyway, and your total fringes would be 0 in that case. But in this case, it's 2 inches times the number of betweens equals 10 inches total. Then you have to enter your loom waste, and the amount that you put in there is going to be based on your experience and your equipment. You know your own loom best, But if you don't know what number to put in there, then I usually recommend at least 24 inches. You can add extra in here for sampling if you want. That's never a bad idea. But 24 inches should be plenty for your project, and even enough for a little bit of overrun. So if, for instance, I decided to weave 20 inches instead of 19.8 inches for each of my placemats, this 24 is going to take care of that. So then the total fringes between the items and the total loom waste, those are your components of the unwoven warp length. And that gets added together with the woven warp length for a grand total of 152.8 inches that you need in your warp. So that's how long you would measure your guide string. And that is equivalent to 4.2 yards, which is more useful for calculating how much warp and weft you need to buy. Now that we've dealt with the warp length, we need to work on warp width. So, desired finished width of your placemat. I'm going to say 12.5 inches. And that works out to, this, remember, is the average 12.5% by default, but I can override that, say, and make it 12%. 14 inches is typically how wide I make my placemat warps. The number of ends per inch, I always did 20 EPI. So 20 ends per inch multiplied by 14 inches in the reed tells me I need a total of 280 warp ends. So those numbers, the 4.2 yards of total warp length, 14 inches wide in the reed, and 280 warp ends all get copied down here automatically. And down here, total woven length, not the whole warp length, but just the woven length, that was that number up here that I said we'd come back to. So we're coming to it soon. If you take the total length of your warp in yards and you multiply it by the number of ends in your warp, that gives you the total number of yards in your warp. If you're winding your warp out of just one kind of yarn, then that is how many yards you need to go by. But if you are, for instance, putting stripes in your warp, and instead of all 280 being the same color, you have 80 ends of a different color, well, you can override this number. This is the only white field you can override. And that tells you that you really only you need to go get 340 yards of whatever color you have 80 ends of, and then you'd put the 200 ends in, and you'd need 850 yards of that one. And if you ever forget what your total number was, it's just right here. So you can put it back in there. Now, to figure out how much weft you need to buy, you multiply the width of the warp by the number of weft picks per inch, which is not necessarily the same as your ends per inch. In the case of these placemats, I know I usually got 9 to 10 picks per inch because I used a heavier weft for my placemat to make it firmer and more substantial. So the length of each pick times the number of picks in an inch gives you the total length of weft in one woven inch in inches, which is not super useful. So we divide by 36 to get that same information in yards. So to weave an inch of fabric is going to take 3.9, rounding up, yards of weft. Now this is where we need to know how many inches of fabric we are actually weaving, and that was the one that we calculated right up here. This is total warp length complete, including the unwoven fringes and the loom waste, but this up here is the part that's going to actually have weft in it, and that is what we need down here. So if we're going to weave 118.8 inches of weft, and each of those inches takes 3.89 yards of weft, then we need a grand total of 462 yards of weft to complete 6 placemats. Now that you've filled all of that out, you can save your file. You can give it some meaningful name, set of 6 placemats. And you can print it. This is what it will look like printed. All that information is there. You can also, if you'd like, to work through the same process on the online work calculator, you can click on this URL at the bottom, and that will take you straight to the website where there is a more substantial version of the same thing. It calculates the same information. It has the same letters here, same calculations everywhere. It just has a little bit more exposition about what information goes into each field. Alrighty, I hope that is helpful for you when you are planning your projects. Happy weaving!